Well, good evening, everybody out there in TV land, as we like to call it. This is Longevity John at the Duncan Showroom with another broadcast for something kind of new. Well, it's kind of new, except we've been trying to do it for 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and COVID hit and kind of blew us off the water. We had weather problems at one time, remember? The storms we couldn't get through. Well, anyway, we're here and we're doing this interesting thing tonight called storytelling. So one of the things, I got my phone in my hand, I was just to remind you to turn off your beeper, because the worst thing in storytelling is to have something that interrupts the flow of what's going on, right? It's just a little bit of courtesy. As a matter of fact, the Duncan Showroom is based on that. We're very much here for originality and for listening audiences. And so you'll notice the way it's set up, all the seats face the front, and it's done in such a way. Oh, I do have to bring up those theater seats you're sitting in. I did answer an ad in the paper some 19 years ago for 150 soft seat theater seats, free, but you had to take them all, right? And so I answered the ad, and I happened to be the first of 17, so I was the one that was able to get them. So I gave them $100 at the end of November, and on December 26th, I was able to pick them up. That would be Boxing Day to most of us, right? But it was the day after Saturday, December 25th, which is the last day that Jehovah's Witnesses needed them in Souk for their congregation, right? Because they were going to be moving and building a new home. So inadvertently, I received a Christmas present from the Jehovah's Witnesses so I could open up a music venue. You can see some irony in there. I do. The one thing I have to remind you, though, is that if you're sitting in for any longer than an hour at a time and you start getting the urge to knock on door and hand out literature, make sure it's ours, okay, please? Thank you very much. Anyway, we're here for storytelling tonight, which is kind of neat because it's something I have a vague idea of what it's about, in that it's the ability to repeat a story like it's being heard for the first time, and with a flow and with a resolve at the end of it, almost like a message that's being given to you like the fairy tales that we grew up in, Aesop's fables and stuff like that. There was always something hidden in there that you, at least as a kid, I went looking for all the time, right? And what I've heard with these people, it's kind of neat what's going on. And what I found out is that there's not just one storytelling group. There's 3 or 4 storytelling factions on the island where people get together and enjoy doing this and share it with each other and hope to get live audiences. So that's the wonderful thing about tonight, and hopefully once a month after May. Marva told me about that. That's the big gathering up in Parksville for all the storytellers. But we hope to be doing this on a regular basis because there's something, if you haven't done it yourself yet and you're here tonight and you want to start trying to do it, there's these guilds and these clubs that are around that are willing to bring you in and help you out and share the energy of being able to tell a really good story. You know, I hope they're good stories. I trust they're good stories. It's a very short story. But anyway, my name's Longevity John. You can call me Long for short, but you can't call me short for long. I like my words, but I'm going to let these ladies do it. Marva's here and Lee's here, and they're going to split off tonight, in that they're going to take turns telling their story and go back and forth. And are we doing an intermission? No, I think we're just going to go straight through, being our inaugural one, and we'll find out if we need to take a break for the next one we do. So our inaugural storytelling venture at the Duncan Showroom. Please give a warm welcome for our 2 ladies.
Well, Marva and I are so excited about the stories we have to tell tonight, we thought we would dispense with our usual introductions, except to say how happy we are that Longevity John has this performance venue, and thank you to Ted as well, who's making us both visible and audible. When I sent out the message, we were requesting donations, and it's not for us, it's to help Ted and Long keep the lights on here, for which we're very appreciative. So what our plan is I will tell 2 stories and Marva will tell two stories, and then we'll have a little bit of a break from storytelling for just announcements, and so I can tell you who Marva is, in case you don't know already. And then we'll do the same thing, another 2 for me and another 2 for Marva. Now, this is billed as tall tales, half-truths and lies, but I do want to tell you that, and every storyteller will tell you this, that all of our stories are true, and some of them actually happened. So my first story is called Whale's Milk. And the Royal Museum down in Victoria, back in the 70s or so, commissioned a Michael Tate to go out and find the stories that working people told back in the early part of the last century. And so he put ads out and various people contacted him. One of the people who contacted him was William Law, and he was a skipper of tugboats and other ships that plied the waters between Vancouver Island and the coast. So he wanted to tell Mr. Taft about By God Stafford, George Stafford, who was quite a well-known local resident of Reed Island. And he said that one day, he said, I was just dropping in at Reed Island to say hello to By God Stafford, and when I found him, he had hollowed out a log, and he was filling it with milk and feeding piglets. And I said, well, George, what are you doing this for? And where did the milk come from? He said, oh, by God, Billy, I'm growing up these pigs. I'm going to sell them to the logging camps for their grub. And I got the milk. This is whale's milk. Whale's milk? By God, Billy, one morning it was dawn and I was in bed and I was woken up because there was all this ruckus out in the bay. There was splashing and bellowing echoing off the hills, and you could see waves coming into the shore. So I went down there, and out in the bay was this whale. It was back walking in the water and obviously in distress. So it was clear, by God, Billy, she'd lost her calf and she had all this milk. And too much milk. So I got into my canoe and I rowed out there, and by God, Billy, when I pushed her with the paddle, she actually rolled over. She knew what I was there to do. I was there to help her, by God, and I did. I milked her, but it filled up the whole canoe. I had to go back to shore and get the rowboat. 15 feet long that rowboat was, and I got out there. It filled up the rowboat too. Well, she was a lot happier when we were finished. And the next morning at dawn, same thing. I went out there and there was all this milk. And this went on, day after day. And I was looking at all that milk, and it was just on the surface of the water. It was going out on the flood tide. And I thought, what a waste that was. So by God, Billy, I thought of a use for it. It's to feed these pigs. Well, I didn't see, by God, Stafford for quite a long time after that. But I was in Campbell River and bumped into him. He was in town to pick up supplies. And I said, well, George, how's the pig business doing? He said, oh, not so good, Billy, by God. No, not so good. Well, the whale took off, eh? No, the whale didn't take off. No. Well, she ran out of milk. By God, Billy, that just shows you how little you know about whales. They have milk for 2 years, and as the young'un gets bigger, need more milk. Oh, no, milk's not the problem. No. Well, what happened? It was a bear. The smartest bear on the island, I'll tell you, by God, Billy. Well, why didn't you just trap it? There's no trapping that bear. There's no way you could trick him into getting into a trap. No way. Well, why didn't you shoot him? By God, Billy, he knows when I'm around. He knows when I'm gone for supplies, and he never shows up until I'm not there, so I couldn't get a shot at him. Well, I know what to do, by God. You get these lanterns that they used to have in the barns, and they have the flame inside. And, wild animals, they're afraid of fire and afraid of light. By God, Billy, you think I didn't think of something like that? No, I hung them up, and, it was good for about 3 months. 3 months, no problem with him. But then in the middle of the night, I heard all this squealing and scuffling down in the pig pen. So I grabbed my 30-30 and I ran out in my underwear. And there was the bear, and he had a sow in one hand, full-grown pig who just mothered some piglets. And he was holding the lantern so he could see his way up the bank. So he must have heard me pull back cock the gun, and he just turned and went, blew out the lantern, and I missed my shot. Well, that could have been the end of the story. But Elizabeth Kelly got in touch with Mr. Taft and said, I have something that I have to tell you about that whale milk story. Now, I've been a cook in the lumber camps for a long time now, and I've known By God Stafford for years because he had dropped by for some chow and my home brew, and we'd talk, and I know that he would never tell a lie, except once, and that was about the whale milk. You see, that pig that got stole, it was a full-grown pig, and it had just had a whole litter, if you call it that, of piglets. And when By God Stafford showed me, I went over and he showed me the footprint of that bear. It was 2 feet long, 6 inches deep. Well, By God and I both knew that was no bear. That was a hairy Sasquatch. But By God knew that if he told anybody that it was a Sasquatch that stole his pig, they would say either it was crazy or was lying. And so he told a lie. But he was getting plumb discouraged about raising these pigs just to feed a bear. Well, a Sasquatch, as it turned out. So I was off for fire season, and I had a little cabin by the water, and I got a nanny goat, and I had chickens, and I was raising a garden. So he gave me the piglets, and I took them with me. But they wouldn't eat anything I gave them. I tried cow's milk, goat's milk, kitchen slops, everything I could think of. Now, the guys back at the logging camp, they always said that my food wasn't fit for pigs. Well, they ought to know. Anyway, it hurt my feelings a bit when they turned their little snouts up at what I gave them. And they were getting weaker and just lying on the sand. They didn't move. And I was thinking I might have to put them out of their misery. And I went out and I looked at them. They didn't raise their heads. They just looked at me sad-like. And then there was a ruckus out in the water. And there was a great big mama whale out there splashing around. Well, these piglets, they looked up, they stood up, they went running for the water so fast their little curly tails were straight out behind them. They splashed into the water, they swam out, and in a line they followed that mother whale out into the ocean. Now, By God Stafford said it made perfect sense because their mother had been raised on whale milk, so they were a second generation whale milk babies. I never saw them again, but I heard tell that off of Ocean Falls and up Haida Gwaii Way, there were sightings of a pod of pink whales. All true. I'm sure you can tell. This next story is based on a Mark Twain short story. And Steve Doubt reworked it, and of course, I have modified it a little bit since, and he calls it The Salesman. Poor sad-eyed fellow standing outside my door. His modest manner, his tired look, his expensive but frayed clothes, struck the last shred of sympathy I had left in my vast and lonely heart. And I could see he had a portfolio under his arm. So I knew that Providence had once again put me in the hands of yet another salesman. But he had touched my sympathy, so I let him in. And this is the story he told me. He said, when I was a little boy, both of my parents passed away, and I was taken in by my uncle, my only relative in the wide world. He was kind and good and wealthy, and he spared nothing in raising me. I grew up in the lap of luxury. And when I graduated, I took 2 of my servants, and we went traveling to foreign lands. Oh, it was wonderful, all the things I learned and I saw in those lands. But one thing that struck me in particular was the custom that was developed among rich people, a hobby of collecting rare and expensive items. Well, I wrote my uncle about this, and I told him about one fellow who had a vast collection of shells. another that had a noble collection of meerschaum pipes, and yet a third who had a collection of priceless ancient china. Well, my letters took root with my uncle, and he began casting about for something to collect. Now, unbeknownst to me, his collecting became not just a hobby, but kind of a frenzy. And he started neglecting his business that he'd spent his whole life building. And eventually he retired from it and sold the business. But instead of having pleasant leisure in a wealthy environment, he was just a rabid collector. And he started out first with brickbats. Then, brickbats. Then he went on to Aztec inscriptions. Then flint axes and other implements from primeval man. Then he tried even stuffed whales. But his first collection had to do with cowbells. Cowbells. He collected every cowbell that had ever been devised by the ingenuity of man. He had 5 rooms dedicated to displaying cowbells. And then there was one cowbell left that he hadn't collected. Only one. But it was an antique, and there was only one example of it, owned by another collector. And that collector would not give it up. My uncle offered him enormous sums of money. Still, he would not part with it. Now, by this time, my uncle had developed the heart of a true collector, which was, it didn't matter how many items you had in your collection. If it wasn't complete, then it wasn't worth anything. And he had lost out on the chance of making it complete. So he got rid of it for almost nothing. And then embarked, as I had told you, on these other collections. And every time the same thing happened. Every time, after immense effort and time and ingenuity and money, there was always the last thing that was needed that for some reason, some various kinds of things that could not be overcome, these obstacles, he could not complete any of these collections. Well, every time this happened to him, it sort of broke him down a bit, and he thought, I don't think I could survive another one of these disappointments. I think my heart would give out. But he couldn't give up collecting by this time. So he thought he had enough personal resources and enough left of his wealth for one last collection. So he cast about trying to find something where there wasn't so much competition. So finally, carefully, he made his decision. He would collect echoes. Now, you may know that echoes are graded kind of like diamonds. So there's a certain number of carats in a diamond. Well, there is in an echo too. One that repeats only once is 1 carat. Now there's lots of them about, so they're not very expensive. Perhaps $50 plus the land that they're on. But you get up to a 2 carat, a 2 repeater, well, those aren't so common. So the price goes up. And you're looking at maybe a couple $100 and the cost of the land. Well, when you start getting up to 4, 5, 6 carats, well, the price is getting higher and higher and higher. My uncle started out with a 4 repeater in Georgia. He got a 6 repeater in Maryland. Well, he really scored. He got a 12 repeater in Tennessee. He got it really cheap because actually it needed repair. Part of the cliff had fallen away. And he figured that for a few $1,000s, he could build up that cliff and actually with masonry make it even higher. And he could probably get 3 times the 12, and he would make a lot of money on this repeater. Well, it turned out that the architect that he hired had never done this kind of work, and he really didn't know how to build it. And so what happened is the echo that used to shoot at you like an auctioneer wouldn't say anything unless given permission first. So that was a disappointment. Then he found a 25 repeater, it's like a Gatling gun, in Oregon. But as he was completing that, word came of a discovery, a miracle of echoes, the Koh-i-Noor, the mountain of repetitions, it was called. And it was up in the back of New York State, in the backwoods there. Well, my uncle hurried. This would be the pinnacle of his collection. When he got there, he didn't know there was another collector already in the field. And it turned out that this miracle should be mountains of repetitions, because there were two small hills and a shallow swale in between. And each of those hills was owned by a different person. My uncle bought the East Hill for $3,285,000. The other hill was bought by the other collector for $3 million and a bit. Now, when they each discovered that the half of their echo was owned by somebody else, well, there's no way either one would sell to the other, because this was the crowning glory, the last thing in the collection that was needed. Each of them needed that echo to finish their collections, and they were not willing to share it. So there was some bad blood and arguments and fierce language and such. And finally, the other fellow, with a malice that's almost unbelievable to another human being, never mind another collector, said that he was going to tear down his hill, and that would be that. There would be no echo at all. Well, so my uncle went to court, and he got an injunction. Well, that began a legal battle that went through the courts, appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And that court gave a judgment that perhaps we could call a 3-carat judgment, because there were 3 aspects to it. First, the court decided that each person, each of the 2 men, owned their hills outright. But they owned the echo as tenants in common. So you could tear down your hill if you wanted to. But if you did, you would have damaged the tenancy in common, and you would have to pay out what the other fellow had paid for his hill. And the third part of the judgment was neither man could use the echo without the consent of the other. Well, of course, by this time, neither one would give consent to the other. And so that miracle, it was a 65-carat echo. If you said something into it, 15 minutes later you would be still hearing it echo. That magnificent echo was silent and tied up in such a way it was no use to anybody. Well, it should be no surprise to any of us that did my uncle in. And I got notified of his death, and also that I had inherited everything. Well, what I inherited was all of these echoes, every one with a mortgage on it. So I was up to my ears in debt. At this point, the salesman turned to me and he got out some diagrams and said, "Now, sir, I am sure I can sell you an echo at a better price than any man in the field. There is a lovely, sweet echo in Texas I can give you for..." Wait, I said, stop right there. I have been beleaguered with salesmen all day. I have bought a sewing machine I didn't want. I bought a map that was wrong in all its directions. I bought an alarm clock that didn't work, and a whole set of different useless inventions. I would not take one of those echoes if you gave it to me. He smiled a sad, sweet smile, and clearly he was a good enough salesman to know that he had, after all, gotten my sympathy. So after an intolerable hour, where he told me this pitiable tale about how he had lost his place in society and his one true love, he defeated me. I ended up buying a pair of 2 repeater echoes when he threw in, free, a third one, which really didn't have much value because whatever you said to it, it responded in German. But still, not such a bad deal, eh?
Thank you, Lee. This story is a story that I collected in the Ottawa Valley when I was living in Ottawa. Again, about a collector of sorts. In the 1920s, there was a feed and seed dealer by the name of Phineas Ford. Now, Phineas was admired by his customers. They found him honest and hardworking and devoted to his wife. But they didn't have any children. And so every Sunday, Phineas would take his wife for a drive into the Ottawa Valley, into one of the myriad of little towns that exist in the Ottawa Valley. And they would stop at any kind of food stand that they saw, and they would buy like strawberries in summer, pumpkins in the fall, and they always stopped for an ice cream soda. But one of the things that Phineas's wife loved to do was go antiquing. If you've ever traveled in the Ottawa Valley, every little town you come to either has an antique store or there's a barn with a sign on the side called Antiques. Well, Phineas, he wasn't terribly interested, but it was what she wanted to do. And so they would stop at one of these antique places, and she would go around looking at everything. She never bought anything. She just looked. Well, Phineas would follow along behind her, but he couldn't figure out why anybody wanted to buy somebody else's old junk. And then one day, they had stopped at one of those barns, and the farm mistress was following them around as they were looking at things, and all of a sudden, Phineas saw something. And he reached over and he picked it up, and he looked at it. "What is this?" "Oh," she said, "very rare. Early Canadian, only found in the Ottawa Valley, sometimes in eastern Quebec. It's called a scamadiddle." "Ah," said Phineas. "How much?" $1. Well, Phineas looked at that again, and he offered her 75 cents because Phineas was no fool. But now, every weekend when they went out looking, Phineas had something to look for. And one day, didn't he find another one? And he was now a collector. Now, the first time that he found one, he came out and he put it in the car, in the back seat, and his wife got in the car and she goes, "What's that?" "What's what, dear?" "In the back seat. What's that?" "Oh, very rare. Early Canadian, only found in the Ottawa Valley." "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to put it in the china cabinet." Okay. So he now had one and then two in the china cabinet. But the antique dealers sent word out that Phineas was looking for these. And whenever they found one, they waited till Phineas came and then encouraged him. Didn't take much encouragement. And he would buy it because Phineas was now paying $2 each. No dickering. He collected so many that he filled the one china cabinet. So he had to get another china cabinet. And then he had so many, he had to build an addition onto the house. And then there was another scamadiddle collector, and he died, and Phineas got his entire collection. So he had to put another room onto the house. Do you know that Maclean's magazine came out? Maclean's was founded in 1905, by the way. They came out, they did an interview, and they published an article calling him the Scamadiddle King. 3 museums, count them, 1, 2, 3, were bidding to buy that collection, posthumously, of course. And then disaster happened. Lightning struck the house and burnt it to the ground. It was nothing but ashes, including that collection. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you will never find a scamadiddle anywhere in the Ottawa Valley. Another collector. This second story that I'm going to tell you is, whenever I tell this story, I am first reminded of my husband's grandparents. And they not only homesteaded in Alberta, but they opened the first general store in Matisco, Alberta. But when the powers that be decided that the train was going to go through Provost, Alberta, and not through Matisco, they had to move the store to Provost. Now, I'm not saying that his grandparents were anything like this old country storekeeper, but just to tell you, that's the picture I have in my mind when I tell you this story, which I got from Doc McConnell. There was once an old country storekeeper. Well, he would try and make a profit any way that he could. He would sometimes put his thumb on the scale when he was weighing out the beans or the flour or the sugar. And if you didn't watch him carefully, maybe he'd just short weigh you. And if you didn't count your change well, he would short change you. His customers, well, they found it very frustrating that they had to deal with him and be very careful around him, but he was the only store for 10 miles around. So they had to deal with him, but they had to be careful, and they had to watch him. One day, the customers were sitting around the potbelly stove in the store, and they were talking quietly amongst themselves. And they thought, perhaps if we could get him to go to church and get saved, then possibly he would become a more trustful person, that we wouldn't have to watch him so carefully. So they began their campaign of trying to convince him to go to church and get saved. And he went, nope, not interested, don't want to do it. But their best chance came when the revival meeting came to town. Now, it was a Baptist revival meeting, so it was a protracted event. Went on for 3 weeks. And for 3 weeks, they tried to convince him, and nope, not going, not going. Finally, it was the last day. And some of them, it was a Sunday, some of them went out to his home and pleaded with him to please just come to the revival meeting. He agreed. When he walked into that tent, he walked right to the front of that tent. He sat in a chair in the front row. He wanted everybody to see that he was there. Not only that, when the pastor or the minister called for people who wanted to be saved, didn't he stand up and walk to the front, pretended to talk in tongues, the whole thing? Well, when he left that meeting that night, he was stoop-shouldered from all the pats he was getting on the back for what he'd done. But the next morning, there were his customers gathered around that potbelly stove, watching. They weren't sure. You know, a leopard doesn't change his spots. A wolf in a sheep's clothing is still a wolf. And so they watched as he went around the store, humming and singing, quoting Bible verses, Psalms. And they're going, yeah, right. But then, little Tommy Jones came into the store, and everybody knew he didn't like children. He would rather they didn't come into his store. But little Tommy Jones came in, and he put a nickel up on the counter. Can I have 5 cents worth of candy, please? Well, that storekeeper smiled, walked back, got a bag, and he put so much candy in it. The customers knew it was about 25 cents worth of candy. And he gave it to Tommy and said, "Have a good day, young man." And Tommy left pretty darn happy with all that candy. And then he walked over to the cash box, and he lifted the lid of the cash box, and he raised his eyes to heaven, and he put that nickel in the cash box and said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Well, he continued going around the store, tidying up, and they still weren't certain, the customers. But then Violet Miller came in. Violet wanted to buy a birthday present for her 90-year-old father. "Oh," said the country storekeeper, "I've got several things that I think would be perfect. Here's a lovely bandana handkerchief and a penknife and, sock supporters. I'm sure he would like the sock supporters." "Well," said Violet, "these are all very nice, but how much are they? I have about $3 to spend." "Oh," he said, "well, you can have it for $3. But all of the people in the store knew that was about $10 worth of stuff he had just sold to her for $3. She left the store happy as could be with these gifts for her father. He walked over to the cash box. He lifted the lid. He put the $3 in the cash box. He raised his eyes to heaven and said, "Honor thy father and thy mother." Well, maybe. We'll see. When all of a sudden, a big red pickup truck came in front of the store with a big, long horse trailer behind it. In walks this cowboy. Tall, lean, big belt buckle, 10-gallon hat. "I want me a horse blanket." The storekeeper couldn't believe his luck. He had horse blankets back in the storage room. He'd not sold any for years. So he walked in. He took the first one off the top of the pile. It was a brown one. It was a little dusty. Kind of shook it off, and he took it out, and everybody knew that horse blanket was only worth about $2. And he said to the cowboy, "I can let you have this fine horse blanket for $24.98. "Pardon me," said the cowboy. "I got me a Tennessee Valley walking horse out in that trailer worth $100,000. I'm not putting any cheap old blanket on him. I want a better blanket." Well, he went back into the storage room. He took a green one out from the middle of the pile, shook off the dust and the nits that were on it, and he came out and he said, "I can give you this one for a mere $49.98. Now, come on. Is that truly the best blanket that you have in the store?" one moment. And he went back into the storage room. He took one off the bottom of that pile. It was red. Again, shaking off all the bugs and the dust, and he turned it so that the faded side was in. And he brought it out and he said, okay, this is the very best blanket. But it's $98.98. Fine, said the cowboy, and he threw a $100 bill at the storekeeper and said, keep the change. And he left. And now the customers were wondering, how was he going to justify selling a $2 blanket for almost $100? Well, he walked over to that cash box. He opened up the lid. He put the $100 in the cash box. He raised his eyes to heaven and said, he was a stranger, and I took him in.
And if that isn't true, I don't know what is. So, this is the kind of thing we would have said at the beginning, but I thought we would get into the stories first. We would like to acknowledge that that Cowichan First Nation, the largest single First Nation in BC, are the first storytellers here. My name is Lee Porteous, and I joined the Victoria Storytellers Guild in 2006. Told my first story with them the next year, and here I am, president of the guild, and still crazy after all that time. Marva Blackmore is a past president of the Storytellers of Canada, Contre du Canada, and began storytelling in Ottawa quite a long time ago now. She and her husband David came to live in Qualicum Beach in 2010, and she started the Tales for the Telling concert series there at the MAC to bring professional quality storytelling to her new community. She is the organizer of the National Convention for Storytelling in Canada, which will be held in Parksville from May 25th to the 28th. And it's open to both storytellers and story listeners. And for the first time, the two public concerts, the Friday and Saturday nights, are available on Zoom. You just have to follow the bread trail in the Storytellers of Canada website, or you can email the Victoria Storytellers Guild, because all of those emails come to me, so I can help you find them. Anyway, it's a good bet, because you'll hear some of the best storytellers in Canada, who are, of course, some of the best storytellers in the world. Right, Margaret?
Yes,
Yes,
and
yes.
from the States, too.
And from the States, yes. Yes. But they're hosted here, so they're ours for a little while. This year, Marva has been chosen for the Storykeeper Award by SCCC, which is a great honor in the storytelling community in Canada. Yes. Yeah, we're up. So, now, we thought about taking a break, but those steps are a long way down. So we thought we would just stay here and tell the rest of our stories for you. In the storytelling community in Vancouver, I'm famous for this. I never show up without a clipboard. So my next story is, it comes from a book of stories that are donated by professional tellers in the United States. And this one is by Jim May, and it's called The Dead Mule. Now, there was an old farmer who had always used teams of mules in farming his land. And he did well by that. Now, he had a pair of snow white mules that he was very proud of, and he always kept them in good shape. He would take them into the local parades, and they were always just so, they and their tack. Well, one of the mules was older than the other, and one day just keeled over dead. Well, the old farmer was, well, I don't know if you call a farmer heartbroken, but as close to that as a farmer gets. Is such a fine mule. So he sent out word to all of the traders in that part of the country to look for a white mule 14 hands high to be a match for his the Jenny that he still had. Well, the traders, of course, make their living by matching up livestock with the people who want it. They try and buy it as reasonably as they can and sell it for as much as they can get. But they knew that this would be a hard order to fill because they knew how particular the old farmer was and that he had really loved that mule. Well, it took some time, but finally there was word from a trader that came back to him that said he'd found a nice mule that was white in color, 14 hands high, good-natured and hard-working. Well, the farmer wasted no time in getting to the trader. And as he pulled up the truck, he parked it and went in and had a look at this, and he was full of joy and delight because this mule was beautiful. It was 14 hands high. It had a coat white as the driven snow. It was in really good condition. Its coat even had what he thought of as a grass sheen. It had been out in good pasture for some time, so it had been well looked after. So when the trader came up, he said to him, "Is this horse for sale?" And the trader said, "Well, I don't need to sell it, but I guess I could." Because, of course, the first rule of horse trading is you don't show how much you like the item that you're bidding on or that you're going to sell. So the old farmer says, "Well, she's not much to look at, but I could give you $75. And the trader said, "For that amount of money, I just keep her here and she can work around my place." Well, then the bidding was on. And they dickered back and forth for quite some time and finally settled on the price of $100. And the farmer gave the trader $10 as a deposit, and he said, "Well, I've got to sell a few calves to make up the difference, but I'll be here at the end of the week." And off he went. Well, the next Friday, the old farmer was driving out to the traders to pick up his mule. He had his pickup truck and was very excited. He was delighted at the idea he could have again as beautiful a team as he had had before, be able to take them in the parades and show them off in front of his friends and his community. And when he got there, he got out of the truck and the trader came over and they had a bit of a talk about, weather and the prices of grain and the sort of things that farmers talk about. And then the trader said to him, "Your mule is dead." "Dead? What happened?" "Don't know. Must have picked up a fever at the shipping fever at the sale barn or something." And the farmer said, "Well, I'd like to see it." "Suit yourself." So the trader took him around to the barnyard, and there, lying in the dirt, was this mule. And it had been kind of warm, so it was bloated, and there was flies buzzing around. And the farmer's heart just sank because he was a lover of fine livestock. And to see that wonderful mule in this state was very hard. He was silent for a good long time. Finally, he seemed to perk up a bit. And he said to the trader, "I think I'll take her." Well, no trader's going to turn down any money. So when the farmer paid out those $9, $10 bills into the trader's hand, he was very happy. And the farmer had a winch on his pickup, backed it up, tied some ropes to the mule, winched it up, had her in the back of the pickup truck, slammed the tailgate, shook hands with the trader, got in the truck, and drove off. And the trader watched him as he went. He could see the mule in the back of the truck with the skinny legs sticking up in the air, and every bump bounced back and forth. And he thought to himself, "Well, I guess I've seen about everything now." And he was very busy. He had a string of horses to sell throughout the county, and he was gone pretty much the whole season. And when he came back, he was having coffee with some other farmers, and in came the old farmer, the one who had bought his mule. And so there was all the farmer talk as usual, that, the weather had been dry and the price of pork was going up and corn and all of that sort of stuff. And eventually the table broke up and only the old farmer and the trader were left. And the trader thought, "This is finally, I can satisfy my curiosity." See, he'd been wondering all of those months why the fellow would buy a dead mule. Anyway, so he says to the old farmer, You know, I've been wondering, what did you do with that dead mule? Oh, said the farmer, well, I reckon it worked out pretty well. I raffled her off for $1 a chance. I made $200. You raffled off a dead mule? Yeah, I did. Well, weren't there a lot of fellows pretty angry and going after you? And says, no, only the one who won, and I gave him back his $1. We'd call it recycling now, I suppose. This next story also comes from that same book, and it's called The Electricity Elixir. It comes from the American South, and the storyteller is Chuck Larkin. So you'll have to picture me as Chuck, doing my best to be Chuck Larkin and telling this story. I was raised on a farm way out in the woods, so far out in the woods that the sun didn't come up until 12:30 in the afternoon. And back in those days, the Grand Ole Opry broadcast from Nashville, Tennessee on Saturday nights. But it didn't get to our farm until Wednesday before we could listen to it. Now, I was just knee-high to a grasshopper when my parents took me into town for the first time. I'd never been through the woods before. Well, we went to Pocomoke. Now, Pocomoke is so small that if you stand on the hill overlooking Pocomoke, you can overlook Pocomoke. Its postal code ends in a fraction. But I saw people for the first time, and I learned a valuable lesson. I learned that people watching is even more fun than baiting a line with a piece of corn and casting out fishing for chickens off the back steps. Now, if you ever want to try this, you just get a kernel of corn and run a fishing line through it and cast it out. And my Lord, those chickens will really give you a tussle. Oh, we had fun when I was a boy. We would sail bucket lids. We would make balloons out of onion sacks. We would chase after cars to get their hubcaps off while they were still moving. Now, there's a lot of things to do in the country, more than just watching the grass grow. Well, this day that I was in town, I was standing watching a traveling medicine man. And he had a flatbed wagon. And on this wagon was an electricity machine. Now, you should know that back then, there was no electricity at the farm or in town. People had heard of electricity, but nobody had ever seen it. And they were afraid of it. No one wanted an electrical pole near their house because of all the strange illnesses it would attract. And even after the houses were wired for it, nobody left anything plugged in because they were afraid that electricity stuff would leak out and ruin the floor. So, all of a sudden, the medicine man started talking about the wonderful healing qualities of electricity. Electricity. Well, I remember what he said to this very day. I am proud to announce to you, my audience, the availability for the first time of electricity elixir from this machine. Mothers, fathers, do your children have worms? Are they sometimes sleepy or fidgety? Do they sometimes act peevish or irritable? Do they sometimes grind their teeth or play the fool? Friends, if your little ones display any of these abnormal behaviors, they're symptoms of worms. For your precious peace of mind, you should buy a bottle of Dr. Parker's electricity elixir. Yes, that's the brand name, soon to be a household word. Electricity elixir can kill worms. It improves a child's character. It regulates the body's systems. It restores frame of mind along with a healthy temperament. Electricity elixir can be taken as a tonic for the inside or can be used on the outside as a cooling, comforting liniment. I know what you're thinking. Can electricity elixir cure everything? Frankly, my friends, we don't know. When rubbed over your body, it feels as if you'd had a relaxing massage. When rubbed on your back and your spine, your vertebrae will self-align as if you had had chiropractic healing treatments.
Oh, I got to get me some of that.
It's only $1 a bottle. Now, when our friends and neighbors took it as a tonic, well, the symptom arresting was amazing. Both heart dropsy and night flotations were stopped completely, and people were left in a looking forward mood. Well, I can tell you that electricity elixir cures hoarseness, improves personality. It stimulates the appetite, and long-time married couples begin kissing again. Yes. But you have to be cautious. You have to take it in moderation. There were people back in my hometown that after their first samplings, they began to feel younger every day. Well, they got carried away, and they took excessive amounts. Last month, their names were in the birth announcements. At the end of his oration, he pointed out into the crowd to a fellow who had a crutch and had a old-fashioned cast up to his waist. He had broken his leg. He hobbled up to the wagon, and the medicine man gave him a glass of the electricity elixir from the electricity machine. He drank it down, and then he busted out of his cast. He shook his leg, he threw his crutch down, he walked around, and then he did a little buck and wing dance. Then a lady in a wheelchair went up and was introduced to the medicine man. When she drank her sample, she stood up out of the wheelchair. She stood up and she walked. Now, I admit she was shaky, but she walked. And then there was an old veteran of World War I, and he came up to the wagon and he said that he was just passing through town and he'd like to try that elixir on his war wound. Well, I could see that his right hand had been shot clean off in the war. Even so, he climbed up into the wagon and he drank down that elixir, and right before our amazed, unbelieving eyes, his hand, a new hand, grew right out of his sleeve, right in front of our eyes, and seeing is believing. Well, that was the end of the free samples. And the farmers were digging crumpled dollar bills out of the pockets of their bib overalls and buying bottles of that Dr. Parker's electricity elixir. Now, I was only 6 years old, but I decided right then and there that if ever I took sick, I would use that electricity elixir cure. Well, I didn't get sick for 7 more years, but then I was so sick. I was so sick, I thought I was going to die. It was awful, a ghastly experience. I had fallen in love for the first time. And don't that make you sick? Doesn't it make you sick every time? I'm sure that they're going to discover at some time that the love sickness is caused by a virus, and there's a better way of curing it than getting married. Oh, I was so sick. Sick. But I couldn't run around saying, I'm in love, like a fool. No. But what was worse, I was in love with an older woman. Now, that doesn't signify anything nowadays, but back then, that was serious. And worse, she was a married woman. Married. Well, nowadays, if you fall in love with a married woman, you just have to wait a couple years. But back then, people stayed married forever. Oh, I thought I was going to die. It was so bad, but it was worse and worse and worse. I was in love with my school teacher. Being in love with your school teacher is a poisonous scourge that dethrones your reason and throws you into misery, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, and into the pits of degradation and despair. Then I remembered the electricity elixir cure. But I had a problem. There was still no electricity at the farm or even in the town. And the medicine man and his electricity machine were long gone. But I thought some more about it, and I thought, well, you know, there is electricity in nature. In those lightning shot bolts, there's electricity in them. I just have to catch one of those lightning bolts, like Ben Franklin did with his kite. But I didn't have a kite. But I managed to not die of lovesickness for 3 more weeks, and there was a lightning storm that came. No rain, but that electricity was snap, crackle, popping all through the sky. So I went around behind the barn so nobody would see me looking like a fool. And for 2 hours I ran around trying to catch a lightning bolt. And I was bedraggled and parched, my tongue was hanging out, and then I saw it. A lightning bolt, and it was coming straight for me. So I ran and I got my mouth under it, and I caught it. Don't ever do that. It blasted me 22 feet back in the air, tore off all my clothes, took my shoes off, turned them inside out, crisscrossed them, and put them back on my feet. Swallowing a lightning bolt is like drinking liquid fire. Oh, it hurt all the way down my body to my toes. You won't believe this, but for the next 3 weeks, all I ate was raw food, but by the time it got to my stomach, it was well done. I used to be a skinny little guy, but that lightning bolt blew me up, and I've never been able to get down to a small size again. Well, did it work? Well, it was 24 years before I fell in love again. And that's a true story.
And let that be a lesson to you. I was raised on the prairies. And I was raised in a little town in eastern Montana called Sydney. During the Depression, there was one road in and out of town. It was a farming community, and so the Dust Bowl and the Depression hit it very, very hard. There was no money around the town, but people, they understood and they trusted each other. It was the Depression. And then one day, a salesman, you've got some of these salesmen, a salesman came into the hotel that was owned by Hank, and he slapped a $10 bill down on the counter. That'd be worth about $100 today. And he said to Hank, I'd like to rent a couple of rooms so I can do some sales things, but I want to go upstairs first and check out the rooms. Okay, said Hank. And he gave him the keys to the rooms that he could look at, and he went upstairs. Hank took that $10 and he put it in his pocket. And then he walked next door to the Sydney Cafe that was owned by my grandmother, Iva Swenson. He owed the cafe about $10 for some catering they'd done at the hotel. And so he took the $10 out of his pocket and he paid my grandmother. And she said, well, thank you. Money's really hard to come by. I really, really appreciate this. She put it in her pocket And after Hank left, she walked across the street to the Snowflake Bakery, which was owned by my grandfather, Sam Maltese. They had purchased stuff from the bakery for the restaurant, and she owed him about $10. So she took the $10 and she gave it to Sam, and well, he thanked her very much. It was nice to have the cash because cash was so hard to come by. And when she left, Sam put that money in his pocket, and then he walked down the street to Club 694, which was owned by my uncle, Paul Jarvis. He'd run up a bit of a tab there, and so he gave my Uncle Paul the $10. And the town had been running on credit, and they trusted each other, and, well, Paul thanked him for the money. But then, when he left, Paul walked out of the club. He walked back to the hotel, and he paid $10 to Hank for some rooms that he'd rented. Now, this story was being told to me by my Uncle George, who's the real storyteller in my family. And I asked Uncle George, why did Uncle Paul, why did he rent rooms at the hotel when he has a perfectly good bedroom at home? Uncle George kind of smiled, and he said, when you're a little older, I'll tell you, but not right now. Then that salesman came downstairs and said he was really sorry, but the rooms were not what he was looking for, and could he have his $10 back? Hank took the $10 out of his pocket, and he gave it to the salesman. But everybody was happy. All debts were paid. Everything was even. Well, everybody except perhaps the salesman may not have been all that happy, not having any rooms. Well, my Uncle George has since passed away, but I think I have figured out why Uncle Paul was renting those rooms at the hotel, and I think I'm old enough now to understand. As I said, I'm a prairie girl. My dad, every summer, packed us into the car, and from wherever we were living, whether it was somewhere else in Montana, whether it was the state of Washington, whether it was Edmonton, Alberta, we drove home for the family reunion. Now, home to my father in this little town of Sydney was a 2-story rambling home where he was raised. It had bats in the attic, and it had treasures untold in the basement. It was also home to my mother, only she lived upstairs in that bakery, the Snowflake Bakery that my grandfather owned. That's where they lived. And so home to her was the smell of fresh baked bread and sugar and spice. Home was wheat fields, corn, fresh watermelon, everything that you could want in a lovely little prairie town. And my father also told me that home to him was walking to school uphill 6 miles both ways barefoot in the snow. When my parents had the opportunity to leave that little town and go seek their fortunes elsewhere, because there wasn't much for them in that little town, they went and they sought their fortunes, but every summer we were called back to home. And when my father was called back, that meant you got in the car and you drove 24 hours nonstop the whole way. The only time you stopped was to refuel And when that happened, you piled out of the car. There were 2 lines, one for the restroom and then one for the drink machine. Orange Crush, 10 cents a bottle. On one of these trips home, we went through a little town in Montana called Paradise. The train actually goes through Paradise, Montana. And after we had done the bathroom breaks and our Orange Crush, we came back to the car. And my dad, he was standing there. The car door was open. He had his arm up on the roof of the car. And he said, you know, he said, the last time that I was in Paradise, Montana, there was this old Indian sitting on a stump down by the railroad station. And he had gray eyes, the kind of eyes that look right through you. And he had crevices and canyons in had crevices in his cheek as deep as canyons. And he had long, long gray hair. And do you know, he could remember what he had done any day of his life. Oh, sure, Dad, sure. Well, as if to prove something, when we all got back in the car, he drove to the train station. And you'll never guess, sitting on a stump in front of that train station was this old Indian with gray eyes that looked right through you, crevices in his skin as deep as canyons, and long, long gray hair. My dad said, now, I want you to go and ask him what he did on any day of his life. No, not gonna. Well, I'm the eldest, so I got chosen to go ask something of this man sitting on the stump. Now, I have to tell you, at that point in my life, so this is the 1950s, my idea of the First Nations or the Indian was based on a cinematic view, mostly Tonto on the Lone Ranger. So when I walked up to him, I was a little afraid. I never carried on a conversation. And I said, hello, Mr. Indian. Can you tell me, well, what could I ask him? Can you tell me what you had for breakfast on March 5th, 1942? Well, he looked at me with those eyes that looked right through you. And he said, eggs. Well, I walked back to the car. My dad was not very happy with me that I had not asked a decent question, but we didn't have time to stay. We had to get back on the road. And so off we went to the family reunion in Sydney, Montana. Years later, my husband, David, and I are driving to one of those family reunions from Edmonton, and we go through Paradise, Montana. And when we stop for fuel there, after the trip to the bathroom and to the convenience store, when David comes out, I say, you know, the last time I was in Paradise, Montana, there was this old Indian down by the railroad tracks sitting on a stump, and he had gray eyes that would look right through you, and crevices in his cheeks as deep as canyons, and long, long gray hair. And he could tell you what he'd done on any day of his life. Well, you can imagine David looked at me and went, yeah, really? So I said, no, I'm going to go see. And I hopped in the car and I drove down to the train station. And you know what? That Indian was still sitting there on that same stump, long, long gray hair, crevices as deep as canyons, gray eyes. And I said to David, there he is. Go ask him a question. I will not, said David. You will. Okay, fine. So at this point, I still had not had a conversation with the First Nations person. I still had this cinematic view of the First Nations. And so, in my best Indian voice, I walked up to the man and said, "How?" And he said, "Scrambled."
And that's the truth.
You thought so? Because I was all,
Well, because there's
I
a
will
witness.
tell you that my father still insists that he walked to school 6 miles each way, uphill, barefoot, and in the snow.
Well, we've come to the end of the stories that we've planned for tonight anyway, and I'd really like to thank Longevity John and Ted Cadillac there for having this place available. And so I'd like to make another pitch. If you're out there in Radioland and move to do it, make a donation and help keep this performance space available. And we promise we will come back. And I'd like to thank all of you who are watching us and who will be watching us, and all of you who came today. It's such a thrill to be telling in front of an audience and in this lovely performance space. I just think this is the greatest. Duncan is so lucky. We want to thank you for your attention. As one teller explained to me, people's attention is a gift, and we thank you for it. We are very happy with the evening tonight and your presence here, and I hope we will see you again. Bye now.
Okay. Yeah, so now I got to get down those stairs.
1, 2, 3, 4.
No, David's got my cane there somewhere.